Hello everybody, and welcome to this season 3 of A Conversation with Cometan. We're on episode 1, and I'm very excited today to welcome back David Mathisen, who was actually the first guest on this this series that I've started to do, a year ago, just over a year ago actually now. And the show's developed since I've spoken to him, and my ideas have developed since then, and I just kind of wanted to welcome him back and have another conversation, and I think it'll be very interesting. So David, I'm interested to know what's taken place with you since I last spoke, and also today's video, I want to kind of focus on astrotheology, which I know is a mutual interest of ours. But first of all, for people who don't know you, maybe just give them just a short intro, maybe, of who you are.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Cometan. Thank you for having me on again. It's a pleasure to be back in the conversation. So welcome to everybody who's joining, either returning friends or those who are unfamiliar with my work. I have been involved for over the past 12 years now in exploring the connections between the ancient myths and the stars. And that sounds exciting, but what does that mean? It's the evidence that the ancient sacred scriptures, sacred stories from around the world, from virtually every culture on every inhabited continent and island of our earth, has an underlying common system where the characters, the figures in the myths, in the stories, and the stories themselves, the action of the stories, can be shown to be based on celestial metaphor, can link up directly with specific constellations. I'm talking about when Moses crosses the Red Sea, there's a specific constellation next to a specific celestial feature that has a little pathway across it, the crossing of the Red Sea, that you can see in the sky to this day. And it's very clear. I'm not actually going to go into a ton of that evidence, but there's a lot of it on my website, because Cometan, you wanted to talk a little bit about some of the the bigger picture questions of what's the purpose and how does this relate to society. And so I've prepared a little bit about that, but for about a little over 12 years, I've been exploring that evidence and growing, as you mentioned, my own thought on this, what it's for, has evolved. And we'll get into maybe some of what I think about that. What I can show for sure is that this is going on in the myths of ancient Egypt, the myths of ancient Mesopotamia, Babylonian, Sumerian, the myths of ancient India, the myths of the Norse myths, other parts of Europe,
yes,
ancient China, ancient Japan, other parts of Asia, the Americas, the nations of North America, the Maya, the Pacific Islands, the continent of Australia, the continent of Africa, the different nations and peoples of Africa and their sacred stories exhibit this same pattern, which is just astonishing.
It is, and I love your work, and I've really it's inspired me, and I want you to know that as well. In the work that I've done, because I follow you on your social media and keep up with what you're doing, and it really does inspire other people as well to engage with this type of research, or just to learn about it, even if they're not researchers. But I suppose the reason why I kind of wanted to speak to you again on sort of broader topics is because I'm so on board with what you're saying, and I think I've probably not watched every video that you've done, but I've watched a lot of videos that you've done, and I'm so on board with it, so I kind of want to sort of broaden it out a little bit more, and talk about, like you mentioned, some of those wider topics that we've been speaking about. But just to kind of kick things off, I suppose, is there anything sort of that has stood out for you? Because I know that earlier this year you've published a new book, and I want to get into that a little bit, because I've done a little bit of reading of that, and I kind of want to just explore a few sort of key ideas that I got from that book. But since we last spoke, which was sort of last October or November, is there anything that has emerged for you in the field since then? Is there anything that has stood out to you, that is, new evidence of something, or anything just kind of in the last year that has really kind of stood out for you in this field?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for that. I appreciate those words of encouragement, and I'm really gratified to hear that you're, as you said, on board with, or
Yeah.
that it has a positive impact is what is what makes me happy, that it's having a positive impact. And I really believe that everybody, these ancient myths are given to everybody. All the different cultures of the world have these ancient sacred stories with profound wisdom that's for us, and somehow it's been short-circuited, or their message has been obscured, let's say. But what's interesting to me too is that every single person, every man and woman, comes to the myths with a different set of gifts that they've been given, a different set of life experiences that they've experienced, a different set of interests and things that really spark for them. So I'm interested to hear in how it's impacted you, and because you have a very unique set of gifts and interests. Obviously not everybody starts this grand new project that you're working on, and so you have a specific set of kind of areas. The questions you'll ask will be different than the questions anyone else will ask, and I love that, because it brings out different. This is really not about me. It's about this ancient wisdom that's been given to us that I'm trying to uncover and decipher. And really, it's like creating a dictionary for a lost language, a language that's it's still there, and we want to preserve it. And the vocabulary has been forgotten in many ways. So just to quickly answer your question, I imagine that you're referring to Myth and Trauma. Is that the book that you're reading? Yeah. So that's my most recent book. And interestingly enough, I didn't know this when I was starting the book, but when it came out, there was this crisis situation happening in the world that we're still experiencing. And it is traumatic. And we'll talk a little bit about trauma. I do have a little presentation, because you asked about some big topics. I thought it might be good to flesh them out with maybe some visual aids to help, because it can get vague and nebulous if I don't. But this trauma that we're going through, I believe these myths are talking on an individual level and on a societal level with positive intention, but they can be used or knowledge of trauma can be used with negative intention to traumatize and shock people. And so I believe we're going through quite a crisis right now that we need to understand what it is. I'll briefly just mention, the story of Perseus in ancient Greece. He was kind of tricked into by a king who didn't have positive intention for him. The king wanted to marry his mother, and Perseus was getting, pretty strong and good fighter. Now he's, growing to young manhood and able to swing a sword around, and big, strong, actually a son of Zeus. And so the king was a little bit put off and afraid of Perseus, actually. And so he wanted to get rid of him. So he tricked Perseus by saying, well, you're not very rich. Everyone's giving me presents. Can you give me some nice horses? And all the other princes are giving me horses. And Perseus said, no, I can't really. Well, why don't you bring me the head of Medusa? Well, nobody's really been able to do that. That might be a little too hard for you, Perseus. And Perseus says, now he's been a little bit humiliated because he can't give the same gifts as everybody else. So his pride, he's already seen red. The top of his head is starting to feel warm and boiling. And then the king says, maybe you can't do it. Everyone who's tried to go off and bring back Medusa's head has failed. Well, that's like dangling a steak in front of a Doberman or a Alsatian dog, right? German Shepherd. Perseus says, what? You want the head of Medusa? No problem. I'll be right back. And off he goes, but he doesn't know what he's facing. He doesn't realize the danger. Is that a good situation? No, we want to know what we're facing. So in my presentation, I do show a little bit about the danger that we're facing. but
Yes.
the gods come and help Perseus. They actually come and say, Perseus, you know what you're doing? Do you know where you're going? Oh yeah, I'm going to get the head of Medusa. Do you know anything about Medusa? Maybe it would be good to know why no one else has come back. Because if you don't know the extent of the problem, you might not know how to deal with the problem. But the gods are there to help Perseus. They don't do it for him, but they give him some gifts. So I think we're facing some big challenges, almost seemingly impossible challenges. But if we know what they are, and if we're able to listen to this ancient wisdom that shows us how to get in touch with the resources that are available to us, some of them from the invisible realm, so to speak. So these resources that are part of our inheritance that we have access to can help us, but we've got to face the magnitude of the problem too. That's why I introduced that story up front. So winding answer to your question, but the picture of Perseus and Medusa is on the cover of Myth and Trauma.
Yes, of course, and it symbolizes so much. But one thing I like what you just said was resources. I like that word, and I like the idea behind that. That there exists sort of a wealth of tools and kind of just guidances, forms of guidance in these stories that we can really apply to our lives. And particularly for me, I'm interested, and I've always been interested in sort of the Eastern world and sort of China, and so anything that you've ever written on that has always interested me. Like you were saying about Japan and things like that. That's always going to be an interest for me, particularly. So if you do any more in the future, I'd love to I'd love to read any more you have about China or those areas of that general area of the world, because I think it's so different from us. It's so it developed sort of separately from the Western world, of course. So I think I like anything that is so different and I think since I've traveled to China as well, I think that's only sort of become more interested in it because I've been there. So that's sort of the particular area for me that I'm interested in terms of those myths. But what I wanted to start with really was the theme that I wanted to focus on today. Whether we will focus on it, I don't know, because we always usually go off on tangents, and that's fine. But as long as we start off on this sort of idea, then it can take whatever form it does. But it's this idea of astrotheology, and it's this term that seems to be getting more use. I think you've even used it as part of one of your book titles, I'm sure. But I think that in the sort of mainstream sort of religious studies community, there's still a lot of confusion about what that word actually means, what it entails. I think there's a lot, and that's good. Don't get me wrong. I think sometimes when we define things so much, we can lose sort of that eclectic kind of those contributions from lots of different people. But there is a lot of voices that are in this kind of field. If you look online, there's a lot about astrotheology being connected to sort of Christ myth theories. To what extent that is true, I don't know. So I don't know if you know much about that, but I might ask you about that as well. But just to sort of begin, how do you define and distinguish astrotheology kind of from sort of the general theology or other kind of theologies for yourself?
Yeah, well, I really appreciate the chance to kind of articulate those thoughts and put them into, and I do have a little bit of, it might be helpful. Have you enabled share screen? If I can pull up some.
I will do, yes. Yeah, that's fine.
But as you're doing that, I'll begin to answer the question that to say, I believe that this term is actually quite old and originates in England with a preacher, in fact, a Reverend Robert Taylor, who was born in the 1700s. I don't have the dates just at the tips of my fingers, but I believe he lived from around the 1780s through the 1840s timeframe.
Yes.
So that kind of time frame, the end of, he was probably a young man in the late 1700s and kind of in his prime of his career in the early 1800s. And he became a minister and must have been the Church of England, but he lost that position. He was, defrocked and kicked out because he started to realize the connection between the stars and the stories of the Bible. And he started to preach lectures on that. And eventually, he probably lost any sort of pension and income that he would have had. And he actually landed in jail a few times for teaching things that were, not acceptable. But his lectures were published after his death in 1851 in 2 volumes, and one of which is called the Astronomico-Theological Lectures of Robert Taylor, or the Reverend Robert Taylor, late of, such and such. And then another one was called The Devil's Pulpit, because he was kind of, he was kind of labeled with some unkind terms. And that one is also subtitled something to do with astronomico-theology or astro-theology. So I believe that those terms, certainly, if they go back further than that, they were already starting to be used by 1851 when those 2 books were published. So this is not a new subject. So let's get into what it is. And I will share my screen if that's with your permission, if it's okay now to do that.
Can you do that? Yeah.
Yeah, ready?
Yeah,
I should be able to, no problem.
Yeah.
Great. So I have a little presentation here. Let me know, can you see it yet? Can you see my screen yet? I just let me click again.
Yeah.
Now it looks like I'm starting to get it. Okay. Can you see Conversation with Cometan coming up?
I love it.
All right.
I love it.
Yeah, everyone loves to see Conversation with Cometan. Everyone loves to see their own project.
Yeah.
Their project. Yeah. No, well, I appreciate I appreciate this conversation. So you asked me, what is the purpose of astrotheology and then you had some subsequent questions, which we might get into, but since you jumped right in with that question, I figured, why don't we just pull up because I'm going to show kind of a rainbow of potential answers to that and why I disagree with some of the conventional, as you mentioned, there's lots of different definitions out there, and I'll try and narrow down what I believe is going on with this term. And I don't use that term, as you noted, I sometimes use it, but I have some misgivings about it because it does tend to focus just on the Bible. That term theology kind of, there are theologies in other faiths and religions, but we typically, when we hear theology, we already start to put it into a context. And that word has been used for completely different discussions within kind of Christian theology, questions of what happens when we encounter aliens. Some authors have written books titling them Astrotheology about that question. What will this do to our theology when and if we encounter creatures or advanced intelligences from other galaxies or star systems or whatever? So that's a completely different usage of the term from what I was saying before, that the stories in the Bible, in common, and by the way, many people who talk about astrotheology just focus on the Bible and say, the stories in the Bible are based on the stars. Well, I agree. They are based on the stars, in common with all the other myths around the world are based on the same system. And usually astrotheology, when it's used, doesn't encompass that wide of a view. But I believe that is an extremely important aspect of it. So I tend to use the term star myths, which kind of encompasses the whole world and is a little clearer too. But nevertheless, as I said, this term has some history to it and it has some usefulness to it. So let's dig into it. Let me show some alternate explanations, which I don't agree with. And I color coded them because as I threw them up on the screen, at first I just had them all in white. And then I said they kind of blur together. So I just used the colors of the rainbow. Don't read too much into it. It's just to differentiate them. Okay. So one, and most of these, notice, are somewhat reductive. They say, oh, you see, the Bible has been, reified and invested with all this mysticism, but really, let's reduce it. So it's reductive. It was really just trying to explain natural phenomena, just like the other myths. They had to explain volcanoes. They were mysterious. They didn't have science like we do. So it's dismissive, it's reductive, it's patronizing, it's condescending, whatever other words are appropriate. It's just an attempt to explain earthquakes. Well, we got to have an earthquake god. Oh, explain lightning and thunder. Oh, that's terrifying. Let's have a thunder god. And then stars moving around. Let's invest those with some stories too. So that is one explanation that you will hear trotted out. I can show with abundant evidence that these stories have so much more depth. There are way more than you need to simply explain the natural phenomenon. But let's continue. Then maybe it evolved into nature worship. Let's worship the god of the volcano. Maybe he won't destroy us. It's still a condescending and reductive kind of an approach. I believe these ancient myths contain profound wisdom, which we need, and we don't want to be condescending towards them at all. And they show sophistication, spiritual sophistication wherever they came from. That is just profound and astonishing. And it didn't bubble up from the bottom up, like, oh, people didn't just start with kind of a primitive, quote unquote, primitive explanation, and then later it turned out to accidentally encompass all these profound spiritual truths. It just doesn't work that way. You don't come up with a metaphor. I use the example of Mr. Miyagi in The Karate Kid.
Yeah.
He came up with a profound metaphor. I use it a lot. Perhaps I overuse it, but I think it's such a good illustration. He came up with that metaphor to help Daniel-san. He already was a master to be able to come up with that metaphor. You don't just wax the car and then eventually come up with profound spiritual truths by that path. You have to already know the higher in order to understand the lower. As Alvin Boyd Kuhn said in a quote, I won't say it, I was just talking about this with somebody else, but I used another metaphor that'll make it quite clear. Like at least in the United States, like if we're doing actual physical contractor work, like fixing a car or fixing a house, changing the pipes, different fittings, different physical like fittings and fasteners. We have this phrase, the male end and the female end of something. Bring me the male end of that, and the female end. That's metaphorical. Obviously, a ratchet doesn't have sex, but it's a sexual metaphor. You don't come up with that metaphor unless you already understand. You wouldn't expect a 5-year-old to come up with that because they have not. Otherwise, there's something wrong. That 5-year-old's been exposed to too much to be talking about, in a metaphor, a male end and a female end. In other words, you already have to know the higher to come up with the metaphor. So I don't believe this started off as this was just people who didn't know about sex and they just kind of they happened to come up with a metaphor of a male end and a female end. And then later on, they advanced a little in age and they learned about sex. It makes no sense. It doesn't work in that direction. They already knew the higher in order to come up with the metaphor. But these are explanations that you hear trotted out. I don't want to, it's to when to plant the crops. That's what it's for. We have to incorporate the cycles of the heavens so that people know when it's winter. And, you can see all of these have some potential validity to them. You can see why they gain some traction. Or when people see that the Bible is based on the stars, they want to reduce it. It's a reductive explanation. Oh, well, back then when they didn't have, the internet to tell them when there was going to be the first frost, it would be pretty important to know which constellations were in the sky before it started to get cold. And there's some potential validity to that, but frankly, people know, I don't need an elaborate system of myths to know when it's going to be freezing cold. Winter follows summer. By the time you're 20, you've seen a lot of them. But not only that, these, why do we have 4 gospels then? If it's just, why is it so elaborate and why is it so deep? You don't need it to be on the level that it is for simply agriculture. And I'm not saying that agriculture isn't difficult, tricky, and full of its own body of wisdom. It is, but these myths around the world, and by the way, many cultures, as I mentioned, were not agricultural cultures, but they are using this same system. The Native Americans did cultivate tobacco and some horticulture, but they weren't really large, massive crop making fields of wheat, stratifying society into, different, it was not, all of these cultures that are using this system are not crop planting cultures. So that explanation goes right out the window there, I would argue. Okay, to preserve the celestial knowledge, that makes some sense. But again, they're very elaborate and very profound. And people have built religions around them for a reason, because they're dealing with things far beyond simply celestial knowledge. Once again, celestial knowledge, don't get me wrong, it's complicated, it's very elaborate, and it's awe-inspiring. I agree with all those things, but I would argue that it's something for more than this too. Well, then, maybe the priest class that preserved this celestial knowledge, then they could, gain power for themselves by predicting a lunar eclipse. Hey, tomorrow there'll be a lunar eclipse, or even a solar eclipse. Tomorrow the sun will go dark for a few minutes, and everybody says, "Ha ha, come on, that's not going to happen." And then it does. Think of the power that even over, over the simple people, but even over the king, perhaps. Yeah, the priest could, "Oh, king, tomorrow I will make the sun go out." So this is an argument, and it makes some sense. Again, I would argue that the myths themselves show us that it's for an uplifting and a positive. It's not just, sure, there were categories of people who preserved this knowledge, but I think the myths themselves, and I labor to show that in Myth and Trauma, the book that you're referring to, that the myths themselves show that the usage of the knowledge is actually supposed to be for the benefit of the people, not for the aggrandizement of one class. This kind of analysis has gained a lot of traction, and rightly so. There's some positive things to analyzing things in terms of power structure, and because those things certainly go on in the human experience. But I argue that these are all reductive kind of explanations. And then some people say, and this is a kind of a specific theory, which I like the researcher who's kind of most associated with this, Joseph Atwill, has done some work to show, but I think the purpose that he thinks, a lot of the New Testament was created in order to trick the people who were kind of rebelling. The Romans were having a hard time into worshiping the Emperor Vespasian, and it's all kind of a big hoax. It's kind of a hoax part 2 from the one just above it. The priest class was hoaxing everybody. The Romans were hoaxing a specific area that they were having trouble with. So they had to try and show Vespasian as the Messiah. And that's the whole, well, again, I don't think you need 4 gospels if you want to do that, with different angles to each one. So I would argue that none of these are correct. They all maybe have a tiny germ of an angle of potential interest, but I would throw them all out, frankly, while acknowledging, we can have arguments about it. But here's what I think it's about. Like I said, I like to call it star myths because it's a worldwide phenomenon. It's not just the Bible. And the fact that the Bible fits into all these other cultures is one of the most positive things about it right there. The fact it shows that, I think all the good things in the Bible that attract people to it, the truth and the beauty that are there, you don't lose when you understand that it's esoteric, but you do lose the bad parts, which have to do with exclusivity. Like, we have the only angle on the truth here with this set of stories, because this is a worldwide phenomenon where they're all using the same underlying system. And I believe it's a sophisticated, spiritually sophisticated, talking about profound things, esoteric code, meaning like Mr. Miyagi's teaching of Daniel-san is a good way of kind of defining esoteric is. It's not that Mr. Miyagi wanted to hide karate from Daniel-san. A lot of times we think of esoteric as, oh, it's a way to keep a secret. Well, Mr. Miyagi knew he needed to help Daniel, but he also knew that a better way to teach him was to go at it from a slightly different way, to bypass some of the doubts and lack of confidence that Daniel has. He can see this young man has some issues. He's been wounded. He's full of doubts. He doubts himself. I'm going to bypass those doubts with a story or with wax on, wax off, because if I just start telling him, he'll have his mind will choke and say, oh, will that really work? I don't think that'll work. What if he does this? What if he does that? Instead, I'm going to teach you a different way. You're not going to know what it's for at first, but then you will. That's what somebody said, that it is a great definition of esoteric. I think they attributed it to Aristotle, but I've never been able to find the exact source. Esoteric is where you learn something before you know it, or you learn it before you fully understand it. And then when you understand it, the light bulb goes on. And so that's what they're doing. So they're using the motions of the heavens and all these different, this is a zodiac, obviously.
Yeah.
But all the different parts of the wheel and all the different constellations, not just the zodiac. The zodiac has a certain, it represents certain things. Other constellations represent other things. The Milky Way represents something else. They're part of a language, a code that's imbued with meaning in order to convey something deeper. It's not just about them any more than waxing the car was just about waxing the car. It turns out it's about something deeper for Mr. Miyagi. It's about, in his case, this tradition that was passed down, we could call it ancient wisdom that he received from his father. In this case, the stars are not the end point. They're pointing to something deeper. So, and to your questions, I often focus on the individual.
Yes.
But it's also societal. So we'll try and maybe dwell on the societal side a little more, because that's kind of what you're asking, I think. And central to it, especially on the individual level, has to do with alienation from self and recovery of self. Just the most profound topic. This is something I dimly perceived at first, but more and more it's coming to more and more focus. And as I've learned about some of the cutting edge current experts in this field of trauma and alienation from self, it has become much more focused for me, because I realize the insights that they're articulating are in the myths. That's what the myths are talking about. And this is also on a societal level too. A traumatized populace is going to behave in different ways. It's easier to turn people against one another when they are, when they're not in touch with self. Mm-hmm. They're feeling insecure, and so their defense mechanisms will kick in almost automatically. You can control people almost like a puppet on a string if you're just able to manipulate kind of their fears or their defense mechanisms. That if you know about this system, you can use it to help people. You could also use it to manipulate people. It has to do with, you mentioned resources. When I said resources, you kind of keyed into that. The resources in the ancient myths are associated with the gifts of the gods. And so we'll talk about that. And it's how do we, maximize that, as opposed to wasting and, squandering and being irresponsible with the gifts of the divine realm. If you want to say the gifts of the gods, or maybe that turns some people off and they want to say the gifts of heaven, the gifts of, at least everybody knows that the sunshine and the air and the growth of crops, at some point we have to just marvel and say, that's a mystery. How does that little seed turn into something that grows and I can eat? And the life in the seed, no corporation made that. Nobody, no human made that. It came from somewhere else, some other realm. And so it has to do with fulfilling potential. And there's kind of a positive side to it and a negative side. Like, you don't want to do this. If you want humanity to live up to its potential, don't traumatize and oppress them. Do enable and uplift them. So there's a positive and a negative side to the message is what I'm trying to show with that little symbol there. So I'm kind of lecturing. I'll stop.
No,
But I've got some more illustrative things coming up.
It's great. Yeah, I'll just jump in. Well, the last thing actually you said there actually really resonated with me, where you were saying about fulfilling potential, because I'm actually writing about that right now, because I'm writing my new book, and I'm sort of stuck on this question really, actually today, literally. So the fact that you've brought that up is quite interesting, quite coincidental there. I think that continues to be a very interesting philosophical question. I don't want to go too far down that road, but what fulfilling our potential means, both as individuals and as humanity, obviously that's a very subjective question, but I definitely agree with you that there is those positive aspects and those negative, infused with morality and maybe people's beliefs, their personality, all these other things. So that's really resonated with me. So I really like that you brought that up. And then also, I really like as well that you kind of, on the previous slide, you sort of listed those different aspects of it. Some of them took me back to my master's dissertation, where I was looking kind of from a different perspective, where, you know, I was looking at the in the Paleolithic and how maybe ancient people, prehistoric people, sorry, maybe used the stars, and that's how I sort of approached it. So I included things like for seasons and determining the seasons. But the fact that you've sort of brought that up now, that's making me question that, which is good. This is what it's all about. You know, I don't think things should always stay the same. So that's interesting. But I suppose in essence, then, in a kind of nutshell, would you say then that astrotheology, because you mentioned this in maybe some of the text of your book, like the description of it is, you mentioned the separation from who we are, and this sort of continual feeling of separation, and you've mentioned it there again, you know, this idea of alienation, kind of our vulnerability really, maybe as individuals and as a humanity. Do you think that then ultimately, do you think that astrotheology or star myths have are these resources that you've referred to, and these gifts of heaven that you've referred to, are they the key? Are they the key to help resolving that issue of sort of alienation and sort of or at least part of that? Would you say that astrotheology can do that? It has the power to do that, has the capacity perhaps to do that?
Yes, I'm convinced that is a central message of what they're trying to show us, of what they're trying to tell us. And so they're trying to dramatize it, kind of like Mr. Miyagi almost, you know, dramatized or physicalized an internal, to get that aha. You know, first of all, even the understanding that there is an alienation from self is something that we resist. Psychologically, if you listen to some of the teachers that I refer to a lot, like Dr. Gabor Mate or Dr. Richard Schwartz or Dr. Peter Levine, Dr. Peter Levine has a quotation that trauma is the most misunderstood, denied. I'm not saying it exactly perfectly because it's from memory, but he throws in all these descriptors of it's denied, it's ignored, it's misunderstood, cause of human suffering. It's a big problem because we don't even want to acknowledge it. It's so painful. It's so painful that the defense mechanisms that we're dealing with that often keep us from reaching our full potential. You know, we all experience self-sabotage or have that experience of saying, why did I say that just now? Or what just took over my brain for a minute there and caused me to do something that now I looking back, I've calmed down a bit. What is going on? This defender, this protector part, as Dr. Richard Schwartz calls them, this almost like an algorithm kicked in and it may be an obsolete algorithm, or it's trying to do, it's there for a positive intention maybe, but it is, a defense mechanism. That defense mechanism even keeps us from, when somebody says you have a higher self or a deeper self, a part of you, a true self, an authentic self that you've suppressed or that you've become alienated from, the defenders who are suppressing it, who are sitting on top of the deeper self and holding it down like a beach ball, trying to make sure it doesn't pop up, say, what beach ball? What higher self? We're not holding anything down. And I don't want you to ask that question anymore. So they do show it, which is, a big part of the problem is realizing it. And then they, I believe, show reconciliation with higher self. I think the whole story of doubting Thomas and his reinstatement is about that. I think the story of Medusa, she's in exile. She has actually experienced trauma in the myths. How she turned into a monster was through trauma. In some versions, she was raped. So this is, they are showing, and then she's transformed in the end anyway, but we have to see the problem. We have to see the problem. Just like I said, Perseus has to know the danger of Medusa. And I'm going to show, I've got a few more slides to show, show us the danger that we're facing, because I want to show the negative part too, because I think these myths are so let me see what I have next. Oh, this is about the higher self. Just to prove, I'm not going to dwell on this too long, but there's so many twins in myths around the world. This is, of course, Castor and Polydeuces is the Greek name. Polydeuces is the divine twin. Castor is the mortal twin. Very often it's one twin is divine or semi-divine, which is talking about not two different people. Which one are you? Trick question. Both of them. The Romans called Polydeuces Pollux, so we're more familiar with Castor and Pollux, but they're these divine twins, the Dioscuri, the sons of Zeus, but one is mortal, one is immortal. It is not two different people. When we start to understand that the myths are trying to show us about alienation from self, and they do it around the world over and over, this is an actual scene from the Gilgamesh cycle. This is an ancient impression of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, and they're fighting this monster, or actually a protector of the forest, Humbaba. It's kind of it's definitely an ambiguous, the whole thing is full of pathos and ambiguity. But anyway, Gilgamesh and Enkidu there on either side are consistently referred to as, oh, they're so alike. They're like twins, except slight difference here, slight difference there. And Gilgamesh is 2/3 divine, and Enkidu is described as kind of a wild man. He starts off very hairy. Which one are we? We're both of them. And we become alienated from our higher self. And just, you mentioned China and Japan. It's actually good for people probably to read my books in reverse order. I don't say this all the time, but Myth and Trauma is my most recent. The second most recent is called The Ancient Worldwide System, and it does have chapters on China, myths of ancient China, myths, a big chapter on Japan, has a big section on Mesopotamia, ancient Mesopotamia, and Gilgamesh epic is talked about in there. Just one more on the twins, or two more actually. So here's from the Maya cycle that is preserved in the Popol Vuh. These are the twins Hunahpu and Ishbalanque. Maybe I'm not saying it exactly perfect, but they are hero twins. They go down to the underworld, just like Gilgamesh and Enkidu. There's a down to the underworld component. Castor and Pollux, there's a down to the underworld component. It has to do with us and our higher self that is suppressed and pressed down and buried, but is indestructible, actually, is no matter what trauma we've been through, our higher self, and this is something Dr. Schwartz talks about a lot, self has these indestructible, irrepressible, innate characteristics of compassion, of courage, and yet it knows what to do. It has clarity, and yet we sabotage ourselves by disconnecting from it. And it's a defense mechanism, and the myths are trying to show it. And here's in the Bible, there's twins all over through the Bible. There's Jacob and Esau. There's other twins in the Bible. This is one story. This is actually a painting by Raphael, the famous artist Raphael. And This is, of course, the judgment of Solomon. And here we have two mothers. So it's a variation on the pattern, and two babies. One's a living baby, one's a dead baby. Who are we in this scene? All of them. All of them. All of them. So that's the individual level, but it percolates out to the societal level. And this is where I argue that you can see societal. It's quite clear, actually. It's not just my argument. It's quite clear that the ancient myths are talking about society too.
Yes. One. I'll just jump in there as well.
Yeah.
So one of the things I really wanted to get your views on before I forget to ask you this was,
sure.
So obviously we have these star myths, and we have this huge variety of celestial metaphor and these great resources that are clearly seem to very, very much bypassed by sort of the established Abrahamic religions, for one, for those collection of sort of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, for the most part, in the sense that, that they generally would say that the stars, the moon, and the planets are proof of God's creative abilities, and they should be marveled at because they are products of God's creative abilities. But in essence, they should not be focused on. And I think that's the general kind of gist, it seems, from the established religions of today. And so what I kind of want to understand from you is, if I link that could sort of current doctrine of the biggest religions in the world, in terms of the Abrahamic religions, if we link that to kind of the current state of humanity, which is what we're saying is that we're kind of separated from who we are, would you say that the religions of today, in a way, have kind of lost their way then? Are they the things that are sort of pressing our true selves down, like you were saying with the beach ball earlier? Are they kind of limiting our potential? Would you go that far to say that, or would you sort of stand back a bit and not kind of go that far? What would you say about how that sort of whole topic there? I know there's a lot to pick out.
An excellent question. It's an excellent, very penetrating question, Cometan. You're asking some very good, wise questions, I would say. I would argue that literalism carries its own seeds of problematic misinterpretation.
Yeah.
So all of the religions that you just mentioned have more literalistic and less literalistic strains to them. Sufi mystics are looking at things in a different way than maybe more literalistic.
Yeah.
There are, Gnostics in Christianity, or there were, and in fact, I believe that Christianity is a hijacking of literalistic is a hijacking of a Gnostic understanding. And even in the words of Paul, will say things like, "You foolish Galatians." I don't have the quote exactly, but I've got it written down here somewhere, and I've used it in many. Who's deceived you? You started with the spirit, and now you're going back to the flesh. In other words, the literalists interpret that one way, but it could easily be understood as, just a minute, I taught you a bunch of spiritual things, that Christ is in you, and now you are going back to the flesh. You're trying to externalize him into an external historical figure. Just a minute, I was just with you a couple of weeks ago. Have you forgotten so quickly what I was explaining to you? Because when you literalize, you externalize by definition. If the story of Moses is about a literal historical figure who crossed the Red Sea, and the people of Israel crossed the Red Sea, then you start to externalize, well, okay, who's descended from those ones who crossed the Red Sea and who's not? Yeah. Because they're literal people. Guess what? Nobody's descended from Moses if he's a constellation. And I can show that the story is based on a constellation, and that the crossing of the Red Sea is based on things that happen in the sky Same with the birth story of Jesus. Okay. And people will immediately say, whoa, you're coming in, you're telling me it's not true?
Yeah.
Are you trying to tell me it's not true? No. Whoever said it wasn't true? It contains profound truths. In fact, Alvin Boyd Kuhn said they're 1,000 times more precious as myth than as alleged history. When you turn them into alleged history, which is something they cannot support, they cannot function as history. Balaam and his ass, or donkey, now we call it the donkey, but in the 1611 King James authorized version, it's Balaam's ass. The ass turns around and starts talking to him, and Balaam starts talking back to the donkey like it's the most natural thing in the world. Well, why are you stopping? That's why I beat at you, because you stopped. Well, why are you beating me? There's an angel in the pathway. Is that a literal story? It doesn't get preached on in church very much because it's a difficult one. And you could say, well, of course, nothing's impossible with omnipotent God. I agree with that. I don't deny that, and I don't deny the possible existence of an omnipotent creator. In fact, Alvin Boyd Kuhn has another great quotation. He says that the myths of the world don't deny that, but they have the sense to be they have the sense to leave it alone, is what he says. He says, no striving after the inaccessible absolute kept them from showing you about the part of the divine that you do have access to. That's the part that's in you that you do have access to. That's what that's how you connect with the divine, is through, if you're divided from yourself, then you're divided from, and the Adam and Eve story shows that. I've talked about the Adam and Eve story and how it's based on the stars. The Adam and Eve story is celestial metaphor, and it shows that once you become divided from yourself, you can see it in the story. At first, they're completely at home with who they are. They're naked and unashamed. Then they become divided from themselves, and immediately they start becoming divided from one another. Then they start becoming divided from nature, and they're divided from the Almighty, the divine, from God, from the infinite. So you better fix the thing that's dividing you, because the way you have access, the way you reconnect with other people is through reconnecting with self. The way you reconnect with nature and the wider universe is through reconnecting with self. Because if you're divided from yourself, you're not going to be connected with any of the other ones. So I don't deny the existence of an almighty, absolute, ineffable, but the myths, I think, are trying to talk about our condition that we can address, that will help us to get into communion and into reconnection and into the right relationship with the divine. And they use these stories. And so, but if you focus on the story, then if you focus too much on the story and externalize it, then you turn it into something outside of you, and you miss how to apply it, that you're in that story. The story is actually about you. It's not about, Solomon. If it's only about Solomon, that's not helpful to me. Solomon was the wisest man in the world, and he was given special wisdom by the Almighty. Okay, great. Good for him. What does that have to do with me? I'm not.
Yes.
How can I ever be? I'm not. Well, no, actually, it's about you. If you get into the right relationship, you can act like a foolish king, or you can, like the wise king, but otherwise you can act like the foolish king, like King Midas. Or who are you in the Midas story? You're Midas. Have you ever felt like you act like him? Yes. But you also have the potential to act like Solomon. So it's a great question. But I think that the literal approach, especially when it becomes very rigidly literal, like if you don't believe it literally, then you are saying it's not true and you're insulting me. That is what has led to the problems. And frankly, the Christian world conquering religion is pretty much the most aggressive of them. It's the one that, it's the one that basically converted Europe at the point of a sword, get baptized or die. And it's still doing that. And it says things like, well, of course, we're the only one that has the truth. And anyway, but the whole literalistic approach is, I would argue, is the mistake. To answer your very good question as quickly as I can. Probably I generalize so much that I'll alienate somebody there.
I'm really glad that you brought up actually the Adam and Eve story, because I've got just a couple of questions left. We don't want to let it go on too long. I obviously hope that you can have you back again. I always want to do that. But one thing I just wanted to get across was the idea, well, the sort of Christian doctrine of the fall of man, which is one of my most interesting ones. I'm kind of most interested in that, because I think, again, there's so much metaphor within that, and even though there is sort of this literalist understanding of it, again, I think there's so much more underneath what that could be applied as. So I mean, in my personal belief, I do agree with you. I think that we are in sort of a separation from self, you know, and I think that we are still in this sort of condition, kind of, I mean, we're all on different paths individually. I think, again, we always have to separate the individual from the collective. You know, we're all on different paths individually. We're all at different stages of sort of enlightenment or understanding ourselves. But I think in terms of a collective, we still seem to be kind of in this, I don't want to use the word fall of man situation, but we kind of still are in that. We're kind of in this separation of humanity situation. And then so the reason why I'm bringing this up was because I was sort of 15 years old, so this is like 8 years ago, looking at studying the different religions and studying doctrines and things like that, realizing that we are kind of in this separated state. And then I sort of looked up at the stars and I thought, well, maybe the stars can unite us. Maybe the stars can, maybe they have that ability to do that. And that was so against everything that I'd been taught, because I was taught that you shouldn't sort of focus on the stars too much. People still in my family and just people that I know tell me not to do that. I'm still going in my direction, though, of they are the most important thing to me. But I say all this to say that, and particularly in the last year since I last spoke to you, that this belief that I have that what I call the astronomical world, which is all of outer space, beyond this solar system, everything that is above us, I think that has sort of salvific capacity, has the ability to save us. It has sometimes I don't use the word salvation because it's a very Christian kind of word. Sometimes I use the word ultimate. You know, it has that, the astronomical world and our exploration of it has that ability, I believe, to get us to our ultimate condition, whatever that might be, whether we interpret that individually or collectively. I say all that to say that can we see some type of ideas of that in sort of what you're talking about, just for my own personal beliefs and things like that? Is there any type of I don't know, sort of ideas coming out of these star myths that yes, it is sort of outer space, it is you know, the astronomical world that does have sort of that capacity? Is there anything that exists like that? You know, that's what I'm trying to get to.
Right. No, that's very, very well.
Sorry.
I love that you have the you know, like I said, everyone is given these gifts, and the myths very clearly, the ancient wisdom of the world very clearly describes that they are, you know, these gifts that people have. Where did, you know, even a parent looks at it, you know, I have two sons who are almost the same age as you are.
Yeah.
And you look at your children and you say, where did that gift come from? You know, that it's not, you can't take credit for it. These are the gifts from heaven, from the divine. In the Greek myths, it's very clearly demonstrated that they are gifts from the gods, you know, that we don't, and in the Bible, they talk about the different gifts, of course, and there are passages that specifically talk about gifts being from, you know, the divine.
Yes.
And so I love that you have that particular urging and
yes.
Pursuing that you're doing. And I would argue that the use of the stars, the world's ancient sacred stories are beyond any doubt, and people may be annoyed that I say beyond any doubt because I haven't shown evidence here, but there's a ton. I've got dozens of videos, books totaling over 5,000 pages with illustrations. If you want the evidence, it is beyond any doubt that they are based on the stars. What are they doing? Now, I don't argue that the stars themselves are salvific as in and of themselves. And we can get into that. Maybe we'll have a part 2 because I have other slides for later, but this is a nice place to kind of think about these questions. And they are using a canvas to show us something about an infinite concept, about infinite concepts, about infinite. I would argue that we have infinite resources given to us by the gods or by the divine realm, by heaven, that and the infinite resources include those gifts that are given to men and women that come from that we have. Those are the most important gifts, and we'll talk about that, in part 2 maybe. But the infinite realm that we have to understand, it's so important. They're using the stars. Well, they're using an infinite realm because the space isn't infinite. It is infinite when we look up into the heavens. So they used a physical metaphor. We shouldn't get too focused on the constellations because actually the constellations are really only seen from our perspective. But it is quite amazing that they are seen that way from this particular point in the universe to furnish us with this canvas. But however that happened, the constellations themselves are not the gods, even though gods are associated with the constellations, but these powers and principles that work their way out through men and women, the characteristics that we see in Thor are characteristics that we see sometimes in others and in ourselves. The characteristics that Athena is associated with, which has to do with wisdom, but also crafts and skills and arts and justice. She's a goddess of war, but not the same as Ares, who's a different kind of war god. She's a goddess of war who has to do with defending the right principles of society. Ares is like, let's burn it all up. I just want chaos. But does that principle, do we find that in ourselves sometimes too? Why, sometimes Ares seems to take over my brain. So they're using specific constellations in an infinite realm to teach us about, but those constellations are not the gods. They are pointing us to the gods who are in the invisible realm, or these principles. And our own self clearly has these space-defying characteristics. I use this example, but there are times when you're thinking of some friend that you haven't spoken to in years, and that friend lives in Texas, which is a state far away from me here in California, and you haven't really been and then later that day the phone rings and it's them, and I was just thinking of you. Well, the conventional explanation is that's just coincidence, but there have been coincidences like that are, and they're so common that everybody has those experiences, that clearly show that there is a part of us that's tapped into something that's infinite, or is connected to a fabric that's beyond, and that is what they're pointing us towards. So it doesn't require space travel, but it's an infinite realm. I don't know if I'm answering your question exactly the way you're asking it.
Yeah, you are. And I think that it's a really good way to kind of end this as well. Just this part 1, hopefully, we'll come back for part 2. We can talk about that at the end. I think definitely, I think that, well, we've seen that today. I mean, like I said before, you brought up the idea of fulfilling potential. I've literally been writing about that today. So we're obviously both tapping into something, we've got similar ideas, we're clearly tapping into something that is the same type of wavelength, if you will, if that's how you want to describe it. But yeah, I think that you answered that really well in terms of the idea that we can look at not just the constellations themselves, but in terms of the infinite realm that is above us, as a kind of sandbox, maybe of potential. That's how I see it anyway, and I think that potential is what will bring us out of this kind of separated state. Now, the sort of last question that I had for you was kind of more of like a cheeky question, because I want to try and see if we can get some more out of you a little bit more. I wanted to know if you got any sort of exclusive sort of news or upcoming books that you can kind of tell me, what things are you kind of working on at the moment? What have you got sort of for 2022? I'm hoping that, we'll have a part 2 and maybe we can do something in that part. But, just for now, is there anything at the moment that you can share with me that and with us that sort of, that you're working on at the moment, or not maybe?
Yeah, no, that's I love it. We don't use that word cheeky over here too much. It's a fun word. You don't hear it in on this side of the Atlantic as much, but I like that you asked that. And I do think, just let me come back to that. I do think, you asked about kind of the trauma of the world or the state of the world right now. I do believe that this ancient wisdom is for healing trauma, and there appears to be forces who want to suppress that knowledge and actually traumatize the people. And I would argue that some of the operations that we see going on around the world are to shock and traumatize the people and separate them. Separating people is, if you want to build an empire, you don't want, strong, united individuals standing in your way. If you want to exploit the people, you want to prevent them from seeing what's going on, and the more you can. And so there is, on a societal level, trauma being induced. And so I do believe that we have to, some people would say, well, it's so hard on the societal level that maybe we should just focus on ourselves, kind of what's called quietism sometimes. Well, I can't change what's going on that level. I'll just work on myself. And there's some aspects of that with which I agree. But I don't believe you can just work on yourself properly without also wanting to help others, right? And so I think that, and we've touched on it already in this conversation. So I do believe that these ancient myths are talking on those two levels. Fixing the trauma at the individual level is important, but it's not exclusively important to where let's all just mind our own individual self and everything else will fall into place. Well, yes, that's a critical part of it, but we also have to have an eye towards helping others. I would argue, and trying to stop the trauma, that's being deliberately inflicted. So I do have a book that I want to write that goes on that, but I'm not so far along with that because I'm working on another project that's kind of trying to systematize this a little bit. I'll just kind of give some hints I'll be a little cheeky, but I do want to announce it when it's ready. I don't want to announce it before it's ready, but I've written a lot of books now. So there's 5,000 plus pages out there people can read, but maybe doing some more video kind of structure to help. There's benefits to books. You can pack a lot of information in there, whereas a video, it takes you an hour to talk about, and you're not even covering everything that's in one chapter. But some systematic, videos would probably help some people. So I'm also got an eye to doing something like that, but it's a huge project. Like it takes 10 times longer to make a video than to write a book, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I love that idea, by the way, and that's kind of what I wanted today to be about. Because even though I like to get a few examples in there, and I love that you brought up, Perseus and Medusa and things like that. But I think that for the conversation to kind of, in a way, go to the next level, I think people need to already be on sort of that understanding level. If they want to sort of, if they need that type of proof, if they want to try and find that, they know where to go. You've got all the books and you've done so many other videos, but I wanted this one to be a bit different in terms of, you know, just exploring it at that other level, on the assumption that what you're saying is definitely correct, or is either partially or definitely correct, and sort of exploring it from that sort of bird's eye view, you know. So I think we've achieved that to some degree, is what we, you know, you can't do it all in one video, but I think we've definitely made an inroad into, you know, exploring it in that way. Again, we'll bring it to a close now, but as always, it's a pleasure to have you, and I really always enjoy you know, speaking to you and following your work. Obviously, I'll put all your websites in the description of this video, so people can click on those if they want to kind of link to what, you know, what you've been saying in this video. If they need to go and have a look at the evidence or need to further explanation, I'm sure they'll find where they need to go for that. And yeah, just thank you for coming on today.
Well, thank you so much, Cometan, and it was my pleasure. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope everyone else will too.
Please come back, but don't make it sort of in another, you know, we'll have to do it before another year's passed, you know, not in another year's time, because then if we only talk once a year, we're not going to make much progress. So we have to make it more of a regular, but I'm sure we'll do part 2. And so everyone should hopefully watch out for that. But anyway, we'll end it here, and thanks everybody, and see you in the next video.